Good morning and welcome. So today, as promised um, in the lecture yesterday, we will be discussing the rule against perpetuities. For your information, there is an assignment on e-learning called Week 5 Tutorial Questions. Question 2 is what we will be discussing today. And question 1, you should submit a written answer through e-learning. So let me put the question that we will address today. All right. Critically assess the rule against perpetuities. So, before we can critically assess anything, we have to know what it is. So, I don't understand what you're asking, Destiny. So, the answer, so anyway, before we can critically assess anything, we have to know what it is. So does anyone remember from last week what the rule against perpetuities is? So what is the rule against perpetuities?
Hi, Sue.
Hi, go ahead.
Basically, it's a future interest in property that would not vest before a certain amount of time after all the lives who would have had possession of the land have passed, basically, kind of.
Very close. So here is how I would describe the rule in a way to here's how I would describe the rule to sort of capture the whole thing. And that's, I would say that any conveyance which creates a future interest that cannot vest within the perpetuities period is void. Now, that doesn't necessarily finish the conversation, because that phrase perpetuities period, there's a lot of information wrapped up in that phrase, right? And this is where we start talking about what you mentioned, the lives in being, okay? And the lives in being are what? Martina, remind me of what you said the lives in being were.
those are any persons alive who would have had possession of the land?
Any persons alive who would have had possession of the land. Any persons alive at what point?
When the land was vested.
You mean when it was conveyed?
Yeah, conveyed.
Yes, that's absolutely right. 1 second. I need to deal with this. Okay. Sorry. Yes, that is absolutely right. Okay. When the original common law rule of the rule against perpetuities defined lives in being as all individuals alive at the time of the conveyance. Can anybody take a guess as to why that rule didn't work for very long? Yeah, go ahead, Martina. I'd like to hear from new folks, but we'll let Martina answer this one, and there would still be heirs to come. Justin says there would still be heirs to come. That was actually the original purpose of the life and being requirement, was to define that people who hadn't been born yet were not lives in being. Okay. But why would that rule of all people who are alive at the time of the conveyance, why would that present problems? Martina, you were about to jump in before I announced Justin's answer. Go ahead.
I was going to say something similar to Justin about, I was going to talk about the heirs and that they may not have been heirs. But yeah.
So Rayhan says there were still too many heirs. I think you guys need to stop thinking about this in terms of heirs. The common law rule, the original common law rule, does not talk about heirs. It says all people. Everyone who is alive at the time of the conveyance is a life in being under the original common law rule. There's no categories of heirs or non-heirs or whatever. It's everyone is a life in being. So with that in mind, what might be a problem? And I apologize if you guys are hearing any weird noises. It's raining where I am, and my house has a metal roof. So rain is loud. Dead people controlling the land is the reason why the rule against perpetuities exists, and that it's intended to combat. Why is it in particular an issue that lives in being constitutes every person in the world? This is one of those things where you're going to go, I can't believe I didn't think of this. It's going to be so obvious after I say it. But it's not obvious until I say it. How the hell do you know that everyone who's alive has died? Like, seriously, how do you know? Like, this is a serious question. Like, you either have to wait long enough that you know that the person who was born on the day of the conveyance is certain to have died, or or you don't know, right? So in effect, the original lives in being rule imposes a perpetuities period of usually 70 to 100 years, plus the 21 years that the court announced in the Duke of Norfolk's case. So the Duke of Norfolk's case is the case that creates the rule against perpetuities. The court says 21 years after the death of all lives in being, right? The original understanding of lives in being under the common law was everybody who's alive at the point of the conveyance. And judges pretty quickly go, well, how do we know that everyone who was alive at the time of the conveyance has died? And they go, well, we only know if it's been long enough since the conveyance that there's no way that anyone could have lived this long, okay? And so that's the original understanding. That very quickly becomes not something that the judges are willing to do. And so the judges do one of two things, right? One thing that they start doing is they start approving what is sometimes referred to as a royal lives clause. And it's basically a clause in the conveyance that defines specific individuals as lives in being. Okay, and these are individuals who are public figures whose deaths will be noteworthy and who will be recognized in the news so that we sort of know when they die. So very commonly these clauses, it's not uncommon to see clauses that define the living descendants of the Queen of England as lives in being. In the United States, what you see is sometimes people use the Kennedys because this is a very public-facing family with lots of public figures, sort of in it, and so their deaths become matters of public record. But there's a lot of conveyances that don't use those kinds of clauses, and the judges were not really on board with continuing to use the common law rule, so they started adopting a different rule where lives in being were defined by identifiable individuals in the conveyance. So let me give you an example of this. I'm going to type it in the chat. To A until B's grandchild reaches the age of majority, and then to C. Okay. Sorry, let me make one change to that. To A until B's grandchild reaches the age of majority, then to C and their heirs. Right. So who are the lives in being in this conveyance? Right? Who are the identifiable individuals in this conveyance? Yes, Justin, sorry. Go ahead.
Would it be, so lives in being, those are the persons who are alive at the time. The persons who are alive at the time, that would include A, B's grandchild, and then C for sure. Well, at least that's what I get. They're referring to the heirs, but is it that the heirs born already?
absent any further facts, this is absolutely correct, right? If no further facts are given, that's the correct answer. A, B's grandchild, and C. If I say to you that B has no grandchildren at the time of the conveyance, who are the lives in being?
A and C.
I'm sorry?
A and C.
What about B?
They're specific, but they're specifically referring to B's grandchild, and so.
B is mentioned in the conveyance. They're an identifiable individual.
They mentioned, but they mention in relation to the grandchild.
The rule doesn't say that it has to be someone who's involved in the conveyance, right? Remember that we're allowed to name the living descendants of the Queen of England as lives in being, who presumably have nothing to do with the conveyance between A, B, and C, right? So just because B is not, just because the event that triggers the condition doesn't happen to B, it happens to their grandchild, B is still an identifiable individual named in the conveyance. So they're a life in being, right? And they continue. And are they a life in being if the grandchild exists? Arguably, yes. I see you, Martina. I'm going to call on you in just a second. Arguably, yes. But you'll find authorities that say that because the grandchild is an identifiable individual, they sort of consume B if they are a life in being, because we assume that B will die before their own grandchildren. Yeah, maybe not, but there's authority out there that says that. Okay, Martino, what was your thought?
So I just wanted to know if that would be related to words of conveyance and inter vivos conveyance.
I mean, yes, right? Because all of this is related to words of conveyance, because all of this is about whether the conveyance is valid. But what words are used doesn't necessarily, the words that are used in the conveyance, like the words of conveyance that are used, whether it's to A or to A and their heirs, or whether it's to A unless, or to A until, or to A but if, right? Whatever words are used doesn't affect whether the rule against perpetuities invalidates the conveyance. Does that make sense? What affects the RAP, the rule against perpetuities, is when the future interest vests. Okay. So does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So okay. One thing that a lot of your classmates have said as we've gone through these conveyances in other tutorials is they've suggested that C's heirs are lives in being. Okay. Some of you may be thinking this, so let me just sort of clear the air on that. C's heirs are not lives in being in this conveyance because no one has heirs until they die. And so the heirs are not identifiable individuals. Okay, so this is a doctrine of estate, of inheritance, that is not relevant for our class, except in this one circumstance. So that's why I'm mentioning it and then moving on, okay? All right, so we have the conveyance, 2A until B's grandchild reaches the age of majority, then to C and their heirs, right? Next question. When do we determine whether the future interest vests? Is it at the time of the conveyance? Is it when someone comes in and tries to claim the future interest? Or is it when the perpetuities period runs, or something, some other time? Sure, absolutely. All right. To A until B's grandchild reaches the age of majority, then to C and their heirs, right? So the purpose of this conveyance, right, for our class is to ask who is a life in being. And the answer is A is a life in being. There is a life in being associated with B, okay? If B's grandchild is an actual person, then that is the life in being. If B's grandchild does not exist yet, then B is the life in being. And then C is a life in being, okay? C's heirs are not lives in being because those heirs are not identifiable at the time of the conveyance, okay? So does this help? Do you understand it now? Okay, so now let's assume that A has died and B has died and their children have not yet had children. And C comes in and says, hey, I want a declaration that my interest is valid, okay? What do you think is the likely result? What is the likely result? What do we think? Okay, C could get his interest. Why? Feel free to come off mute.
Hello? You hearing me? Hello? Okay.
I can hear you. What's up? Go ahead.
Well, what you said there was that B has no grandchildren, etc., right? So it essentially has no other lives in being other than B to pass to, right?
Right.
So unless well, since C is specifically named, I would think that he would have more preference rather than B, who is named. Yes, he is alive in Like,
Well,
life in B.
remember, under this conveyance, B gets nothing. Like there is no interest for B,
Right,
right?
yeah.
A holds the defeasible fee, C holds the future interest. Um, so B is not in the picture. The question is C's interest valid, sufficient to allow us to say that we can allow it to continue to exist?
So it has no grandchild. It has, like, the next in line should be him. There's no.
So B has no grandchildren at the time that C is asking for the quiet title. Okay. But they have a child, and the child has no children yet. So does C win in the quiet title, or does A? Okay, you've changed your mind. Why?
Can you repeat the scenario you gave again? The last
Sure.
that you said.
Sure. A and B have died. So A's heirs are now holding under the defeasible fee. B has a child, but no grandchildren. C files a quiet title seeking a declaration that their future interest is valid. A argues that C's interest violates the rule against perpetuities. Who wins?
Isn't A dead? Isn't
Sorry,
A dead?
A? Why?
No, didn't you say A died?
A's heirs. A, his heirs, interchangeable, but yes. A's heirs argue that C's interest is void under the rule against perpetuities.
I think that C should be able to get it, but
okay.
The fact that, I mean, it's a future interest per se, so that is where I kind of having difficulty panning it out, because if it is that B has has a child, but that child hasn't had a child yet, is it that we have to wait until?
Okay.
Before C could...
This is exactly where I wanted you to go. Thank you, Justin. You have done exactly what I wanted you to do. Danielle, you're asking exactly the right question. Under the original common law formulation, the point in time where we determine whether the future interest is certain to vest is at the time of the conveyance. So let me put the conveyance back in the chat so that everybody can see it. Okay, and just as a reminder, A and B have died. B has a living child, but no grandchild. Okay. So under the common law, at the time of the conveyance, it is not certain that the condition will be met within the perpetuities period, right? Because A and B and C could all die and B still have no grandchildren. And then 21 years later, none of B's grandchildren have reached the age of majority because they don't exist. and so the interest would fail. Under the common law rule, because that is the state of affairs at the time of the conveyance, we assume, right, we decide that C's interest is void because it is not certain to vest. This is also a very difficult rule to apply in the sort of many different types of fact patterns that can arise, including the one that Danielle raises of what happens if the grandchild never gets born. And so many jurisdictions have adopted what is called a wait and see approach, exactly what Justin suggested, where they say, okay, we're going to let the perpetuities period run, and if at the end of the perpetuities period, the future interest has not vested, it is void. If at some point in the perpetuities period it does vest, then that means it was valid. Lots and lots of jurisdictions have adopted the wait and see approach. Now, what I will say is that most of the wait and see adoptions have been done via statute. And when the rule against perpetuities is defined by statute, almost always there is a much longer perpetuities period, right? So for example, Barbados uses an 80-year perpetuities period. The Cayman Islands uses 150 years perpetuities period. The American Law Institute, in the Uniform Statutory Rule Against Perpetuities that they offer to American states, uses a 90-year perpetuities period. Florida has adopted a 360-year perpetuities period, right? All of these jurisdictions have adopted much longer perpetuities periods than the common law, but they've also eliminated the lives in being requirement. So the 80 years or the 150 years or the 360 years starts to run at the time of the conveyance. So we don't have to figure out who's the lives in being and have they all died. We can just go, oh, it's been 80 years since the conveyance and the future interest hasn't vested, and so it is void. Okay? So these are all sort of different ways to approach the rule against perpetuities. Okay? But then there's Guyana, right? In Guyana, there's no such thing as future interests. You hold the property, you own it absolutely, right? When you convey it, you convey everything you own. And you can't hold back the ability to control a future disposition, okay? At the other extreme, you have a lot of jurisdictions, the Bahamas being prominent in the Caribbean, but lots of American states have done this as well, where they've simply abolished the rule against perpetuities. They said, this is too hard for us to figure out, it's too complicated, the facts get too messy, we can't apply this in a coherent way, we are simply going to abolish it altogether. And so in jurisdictions that have done that, like the Bahamas, I have the ability as the holder of the fee simple, the present interest, to define a chain of future interests that will go on for centuries, for 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 years, and all of those conveyances will be valid. So here's the question, right? This is sort of the point. We now understand the rule, so now we can start to talk about it critically. The purpose of the rule, the public policy that is served by the rule, is to strike a balance in allowing people to determine how and by whom their property will be used, even after their death. And making sure that, Justin, I'm gonna get to your question. And making sure that property is controlled by the living, right? So it's a balancing act. And we've decided that we're going to allow people to control the disposition of their property even after they no longer own it for a certain period of time. And then after that period of time, we're going to take that away from them. Okay? So Justin asks, what happens if B's child doesn't have a child, but rather adopts one who is of the age of majority? So this is one reason why some jurisdictions have just abolished the rule against perpetuities, because they look at fact patterns like this and they go, we don't know how to handle this. But in jurisdictions that have not abolished the rule against perpetuities, right, adopted children are, in most jurisdictions, treated the same as children of the blood, right? You may have an issue with entailed estates, right, that we talked about yesterday in the lecture, but for the most part, for these kinds of, for things where the rule against perpetuities apply, because it doesn't apply to fee tail. So for issues related to the fee simple determinable or the condition subsequent, an adopted child is a child, right? There's no difference between the two. There may be jurisdictions where that's not the case, where adopted children are treated differently, or where half children are treated differently, right? I don't know of any. So, but I don't know everything in every jurisdiction here and forever, right? Okay. So, does this make sense? Do we understand kind of the issue of the adopted child? Does that make sense? That in most jurisdictions, it's going to be treated the same, and that's going to trigger the condition, and the future interest will vest if it's within the perpetuities period. So, okay. So then the next question, right? This policy judgment, this balancing act between allowing for the disposition of the control over the disposition of your own property and making sure that property is controlled and owned by the living. Where's the right balance? Is it the Guyanese model of no future interests and only present holders matter? Is it the Bahamian model of future interests forever and no questions asked, and we'll create a legislature of corpses to control how land is disposed of? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And if it is, how long should we let people control the disposition of property they no longer own? So this is the question that's before you. I'll shut up now. So what do we think? So we have these two, we have this policy judgment, right? This balancing act between present holders and past holders and who gets to control the disposition of property, right? We have the Guyanese model where present holders are completely in control. We have the Bahamian model where past holders have rights forever, right? Have disposition rights forever. And then we have the other jurisdictions that fall somewhere in between. The question is, who is, what's the right approach? Where's the right balance? There's not really a right answer to this question. Okay, so you should feel comfortable sort of throwing out half-baked, or should. I hope you'll feel comfortable throwing out, sort of half-baked ideas and things that you haven't really thought through, and maybe you're going to think out loud with us, and that's okay, right? Because there's not a right or wrong answer to these kinds of questions. It's all about what's the reasoning that leads you to your conclusion. Okay, so you're sort of on board with the Guyanese model of only present holders can dispose of property, and there's no such thing as future interests. So now it's worth noting that you can take a Bahamian approach, and you can say, we don't, we're never going to void a future interest. And so once you're in line, you're in line, you're going to hold at some point, right? That is an approach. Martina, why do you think that the common law position strikes a good balance? Sure, I understand. I'm mean, I think, I think that where you fall on sort of what the right balance is, there's room for reasonable people to disagree about this. And we can see that sort of in the variety of different periods that come into play. I will say that I think that the statutes that impose 80 and 90 year periods from the conveyance are attempts to more or less replicate the common law rule with a little more certainty, right? So rather than having to figure out lives and being and are they all dead and there's some uncertainty regarding how long that's going to take, you just know that it's X number of years from the date of conveyance. So but I think that, I think there's room for people to decide that they prefer the Guyanese approach. I think there's room for people to decide that the Bahamian approach serves certain policy purposes. And so I don't want you to think that I'm prescribing a particular outcome here. I don't have a strong opinion about this, except that my only really strong opinion about the rule against perpetuities is that I wish I didn't have to teach it. But that's the only opinion I have. So this is the rule against perpetuities, right? It's hard and it's complicated, and there's lots of places where the legislature has sort of thrown up its hands and just said that they don't want to be involved with this they don't want to have to deal with this anymore. And so they've either abolished it or they've made such a long perpetuities period that it never really comes into play. But you need to at least have had a chance to grapple with this and to recognize that it's something that comes up. Okay, because unless you're in a jurisdiction that's abolished the rule against perpetuities, when you're involved with the conveyance of property and the creation of future interests, you have to be thinking about whether the rule applies and whether it is implicated and to potentially void your future interests. Okay, so we're going to wrap things up here. I really appreciate everyone's hard work and hard thinking. This is one of the most complicated topics in the common law, and you guys did a really great job with it. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate your effort on that. So we'll see you guys tomorrow, and we'll take care then. So once again, submit a written answer to question 1 on e-learning, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.